Without firing a single shot on the ground, one industrial region decided how long the Luftwaffe could stay in the air and how far German tanks could still move. For more than a year, the war over Ploiești was fought pipe by pipe, runway by runway, and barrel by barrel. The question was never whether the oil would be hit, but how long it could survive before the entire Axis war machine began to starve. In the interwar period, the oil fields of southern Romania formed one of the most concentrated and strategically significant petroleum centers in Europe. The Ploiești region, located approximately 60 kilometers north of Bucharest, had been producing oil since the mid-19th century. By 1938, Romania ranked among the top 6 oil-producing countries in the world. Annual production that year reached approximately 6.5 million metric tons. Refining capacity expanded rapidly during the late 1930s, with more than 10 major refineries operating around Ploiești by the outbreak of the Second World War. Germany entered the war with limited domestic oil reserves. Synthetic fuel plants provided part of its requirements, but crude oil imports remained essential. Following the British naval blockade imposed in September 1939, German access to overseas petroleum supplies effectively ended. Romanian oil became the largest external source available to the German war economy. Between 1940 and 1943, Germany received between 5.5 and 6.8 million tons of Romanian crude oil and refined products annually. This supply accounted for approximately 30 to 35% of total German fuel consumption in some years. Romania's geopolitical position shifted decisively in 1940. In June, the Soviet Union occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In August, Romania ceded northern Transylvania to Hungary by the Second Vienna Award, followed by the loss of southern Dobruja to Bulgaria in September. These territorial losses fractured political stability inside the country and weakened King Carol II. In September 1940, General Ion Antonescu took power and aligned Romania formally with Germany. On 23 November 1940, Romania signed the Tripartite Pact and entered the Axis alliance. German military missions arrived soon afterward. One of their primary tasks was the protection and expansion of the Ploiești oil infrastructure. By early 1941, German Luftwaffe units and ground-based air defense formations were deployed in increasing numbers around the oil region. The oil fields were designated a strategic zone vital to the prosecution of the war. By the time Germany initiated the invasion of the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, Ploiești had become indispensable to the Eastern Campaign. Fuel requirements for Operation Barbarossa were calculated at over 600,000 tons per month during peak operational phases. Romanian oil supplied a significant portion of this demand. Romanian armed forces also participated directly in the invasion, committing over 325,000 troops during the initial phase. The United States entered the war in December 1941. From that point, the Allied strategic bombing campaign expanded toward targets that could affect Axis war production beyond Western Europe. The combined bomber offensive developed during 1942 identified petroleum production as one of several industrial systems whose disruption could directly limit German operational capacity. British and American planners recognized that a sustained interruption of Romanian oil output could reduce Axis air and mechanized ground operations across multiple theaters. The geographic isolation of Ploiești imposed technical and operational challenges for Allied air forces. Radar coverage developed unevenly. German Freya and Würzburg stations were emplaced in limited numbers, providing early warning but incomplete low-altitude detection. Visual observation posts remained central to air warning, particularly against low-level attack profiles. Public sentiment within Romania reflected the strategic importance of the oil region. Civil defense measures expanded during 1942 and 1943. Air raid shelters were constructed in refinery districts and residential neighborhoods. Evacuation plans existed for refinery workers, but were only partially implemented due to the continuous operational requirements of production. By early 1943, intelligence estimates on both sides had hardened. Allied planners calculated that short-term oil output losses of greater than 40% could force fuel rationing across the German armed forces within weeks. Axis Command assessed that Ploiești could withstand limited bombing, but would remain vulnerable to repeated concentrated attacks, especially if defensive systems were saturated. By mid-1943, the convergence of fuel dependency, expanded Allied air reach, and maturing defensive preparations transformed Ploiești from a protected rear area asset into a frontline strategic objective. The conditions were now set for a series of air operations whose scale and intensity would exceed anything yet experienced by the Romanian oil region. By the spring of 1943, the operational situation around the Ploiești oil region shifted from distant strategic consideration to imminent battlefield reality. The opening phase of the Allied effort to strike Romanian oil infrastructure began not with the large-scale American raids for which the region later became known, but with a series of probing reconnaissance flights and limited bombing operations intended to test Axis defenses and refine navigation routes. These early actions established the framework for what would soon become one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Europe. The first direct Allied attack on the Ploiești system was carried out on 12 June 1942 by 13 USAF B-24 Liberator bombers launched from Faid airfield in Egypt. This mission, later designated the Halvorsen Project, targeted the Astra Romana refinery. The aircraft flew over 2,000 kilometers across the Mediterranean and the Balkans at high altitude. Due to navigation errors, cloud cover, and limited target identification, only minor damage was inflicted. Of the 13 bombers dispatched, one was lost to anti-aircraft fire near the target area, and several others sustained damage. Romanian production losses were negligible, estimated at under 2% for the following month. Despite its limited physical impact, the June 1942 raid had significant strategic implications. Strategic analysts calculated that sustained disruption exceeding 40% of monthly output could create immediate cascading shortages across Axis air operations and mechanized forces. However, early bombing results demonstrated that isolated high-altitude attacks produced only short-term output losses due to rapid emergency repairs and extensive stockpiles of refined fuel. By May 1943, the opening phase transitioned decisively from experimental strikes to planned large-scale operations. Both sides now recognized that future engagements over Ploiești would not resemble conventional strategic bombing campaigns over Western Europe. The density of the defenses, the geographical isolation, and the concentration of industrial assets compressed into a narrow zone ensured that subsequent operations would involve close-range engagement under extreme anti-aircraft conditions, with losses expected on both sides. Strategic planning for the air war over Ploiești reached full development during the late spring and summer of 1943, as both the Allied and Axis commands refined their objectives, doctrines, and logistical assumptions. For the Allies, the oil target system in Romania was formally elevated to a top priority within the broader combined bomber offensive. In May 1943, Allied planners estimated that German armed forces required between 750,000 and 900,000 tons of petroleum products per month to sustain air, naval, and mechanized ground operations. Romanian oil accounted for roughly one-third of that total. Disabling Ploiești was therefore assessed as one of the few single-target operations capable of producing immediate operational effects across multiple theaters. American planners under the 15th Air Force, operating from North Africa, developed strike concepts based on precision bombing of specific refineries rather than area saturation. The objective was not simply to damage storage tanks, which could be rapidly repaired or bypassed, but to destroy cracking units, distillation towers, pumping stations, and pipeline junctions that required specialized equipment and months of reconstruction. Intelligence surveys conducted through aerial photography and industrial analysis identified Astra Romana, Columbia Aquila, Steaua Romana, Creditul Minier, and Unirea Speranța as primary targets. The core operational challenge lay in distance, navigation, and defensive density. From Libyan airfields near Benghazi and Soluk, B-24 formations faced a round trip of approximately 2,400 kilometers. Even under optimal fuel load and cruising conditions, this left little margin for evasive routing or extended combat maneuver. Early planning assumed high-altitude attacks, but test missions demonstrated that heavy cloud cover over the Balkans frequently obscured targets and degraded bombing accuracy to below acceptable thresholds. By June 1943, a new low-altitude strike doctrine was developed for the Ploiești objective. This concept involved terrain-following ingress at altitudes below 60 meters to avoid radar detection, followed by pop-up attacks directly over refinery complexes. The method sacrificed altitude protection in exchange for bombing precision. Bomb load per aircraft was limited to allow safe, low-level flight. Each B-24 typically carried between 6 and 8 500 lb bombs under this profile. At full operational scale, a single major raid was projected to involve over 175 heavy bombers, with more than 1,700 crew members exposed during each mission. Fuel planning, maintenance cycles, spare aircraft pools, and replacement crew allocations were adjusted accordingly. For every large raid, USAAF planners expected average attrition rates between 10 and 20% based on preliminary defensive assessments. Axis defensive planning developed in parallel. By mid-1943, total anti-aircraft artillery protection around Ploiești exceeded 230 heavy and medium guns. This included approximately 90 heavy caliber 88 mm and 105 mm guns, over 100 medium 37 meters and 40 mm guns, and more than 40 light caliber 20 meter systems positioned near key refinery installations. Gun sites were arranged in concentric bands with overlapping fields of fire. Fire control coordination was centralized through sector command posts linked by landline and radio. Fighter defense was reorganized under German operational control while maintaining Romanian squadron participation. By July 1943, approximately 90 Bf-109s and 80 Romanian IAR-80 and IAR-81 fighters were assigned to Ploiești defense on rotational readiness. Aircraft dispersal fields were constructed around Târgșor, Pipera, Mizil, and Zilistea to reduce vulnerability to preemptive strikes. Scramble response time under alert conditions was reduced to under 5 minutes. Axis logistical planning emphasized immediate repair capability rather than long-term redundancy. Mobile engineering units equipped with cranes, welding systems, pipe stocks, and electrical components were stationed permanently near refinery centers. Emergency repair teams were trained to restore partial output within 24 to 72 hours after damage. Fuel stockpiles equal to several weeks of average production were dispersed across underground and rural storage sites to mitigate sudden output losses. Propaganda and counterintelligence formed a secondary but integrated element of strategy. German and Romanian authorities publicized the strength of air defenses to discourage further Allied attacks, while concealing true repair times and output resilience. Dummy refineries, decoy storage tanks, and false pipeline routes were constructed to mislead reconnaissance and absorb bomb damage. By late July 1943, both sides had completed their primary planning cycles. The Allies had committed to a mass low-level strike intended to deliver immediate cascading destruction across multiple refineries in a single operation. Axis command had concentrated defensive power within one of the densest air defense networks in Europe. Each side now proceeded under the assumption that the first full-scale clash would not be a probing attack, but a decisive test of whether Ploiești could be neutralized in a single day, or whether its defensive system could absorb and recover from concentrated assault. On 1st August 1943, the Allied strategic air campaign against the Ploiești oil complex entered its first full-scale combat phase with the launch of Operation Tidal Wave. At 04 local time, 177 B-24 Liberator bombers from the U.S. 9th Air Force took off from 5 airfields in eastern Libya. The attacking force consisted primarily of units from the 98th and 376th bomb groups, supported by additional groups temporarily transferred for the mission. Total aircrew strength exceeded 1,700 personnel. Each aircraft carried between 6 and 8 500 bombs configured for low-level release. The planned route carried the formation north across the Mediterranean, over the Ionian Sea, across Greece, and then through the mountainous terrain of Bulgaria before descending to attack altitude for the final approach into southern Romania. The mission profile required strict radio silence and visual formation integrity. Aircraft were instructed to descend to altitudes between 50 and 60 meters for the final attack run in order to evade radar detection and high-altitude flak tracking. At approximately Aero 9:30, the leading elements crossed the Bulgarian coast and began their descent toward the target corridor. Navigation errors emerged almost immediately. One major subgroup, led by the 376th Bomb Group, deviated from the planned turn point near Târgoviște, initiating its attack run from the wrong approach axis. This deviation exposed portions of the force to defensive fire earlier than anticipated and disrupted the synchronized strike plan. By 10 South, Axis early warning systems detected multiple low-altitude bomber streams approaching from the south. Visual observation posts and limited radar coverage provided sufficient warning for fighter interception and flak coordination. Romanian and German anti-aircraft batteries were fully activated as the first American bombers entered the defensive perimeter. The initial wave encountered dense anti-aircraft fire as it crossed the outer defensive belt. Heavy caliber 88mm and 105mm guns engaged at low traverse angles, while 37mm and 20mm guns formed continuous fire corridors along refinery approaches. Bombers were forced to fly through concentrated fire zones less than 3,000 meters deep. Several aircraft were hit before reaching release points. Within the first 5 minutes of engagement, at least 8 B-24s were destroyed by direct gunfire or forced into low-altitude crash landings. Fighter interception followed rapidly. Romanian IAR-80 and IAR-81 fighters, along with German Bf-109 units, engaged the bomber formations at altitudes between 100 and 500 meters. Due to the compressed engagement space, air combat occurred directly over industrial and residential zones. Multiple bombers were shot down during turning maneuvers following bomb release, often while flying at speeds below 300 kilometers per hour. The Astra Romana refinery, one of the largest in the complex, was struck by elements of the 376th Bomb Group. Bomb impacts destroyed several cracking units, storage tanks, and pumping stations. Secondary explosions ignited multiple fuel reserves. At Columbia Aquila, low-level bombing caused extensive damage to fractionating towers and tanker loading infrastructure. Fires propagated rapidly due to interconnected pipeline systems. At Unirea Speranța, bomb damage disrupted power generation and pipeline junctions, halting operations entirely for several hours. Civilian areas adjacent to several refineries sustained direct impact from low-altitude bombing and secondary fuel explosions. Residential districts near Astra Romana and Creditul Minier were struck by stray ordnance and debris. Precise casualty figures for civilians on 1st August vary, but post-war estimates indicate between 400 and 600 Romanian civilians were killed or wounded during the raid. Losses among the attacking force escalated rapidly during the withdrawal phase. Aircraft damaged on ingress faced sustained fire while climbing away from the target zone. Several bombers attempted emergency landings in neutral Turkey, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. Others crashed into refinery structures or surrounding farmland. By the end of the mission, 53 B-24 bombers had been destroyed, representing approximately 30% of the attacking force. A total of 660 Allied aircrew casualties were recorded, including 310 killed, 108 captured, and the remainder interned or wounded. Despite the scale of destruction observed on the ground, immediate production losses were uneven. Initial post-attack assessments estimated that Romanian oil output dropped by approximately 40% for September 1943, but rapid emergency repairs restored partial production within weeks. Several refineries resumed limited operations within 10 to 14 days by rerouting pipelines, bypassing destroyed cracking units, and shifting refining priorities. Operation Tidal Wave marked the first direct large-scale collision between Allied strategic air power and the full defensive network of the Ploiești oil zone. It demonstrated that even at extreme low altitudes, sustained penetration of the defensive belt imposed severe losses on attacking forces. At the same time, it confirmed that concentrated attacks could temporarily disrupt multiple critical production nodes in a single mission. The strategic contest over Romanian oil now entered a phase of sustained escalation rather than isolated strikes. Following the August 1943 raid, the defensive contest around Ploiești entered its most volatile period as both sides reassessed their losses, reorganized their forces, and prepared for continued operations. The escalation phase began immediately after Operation Tidal Wave, when Axis Command recognized that despite the severe defensive effort, refinery complexes had sustained measurable damage across several key facilities. Romanian and German authorities initiated rapid reconstruction, deploying thousands of engineers, technicians, and refinery workers to restore critical systems. Repair units operated continuously, often in 24-hour shifts, to rebuild cracking units, reconnect pipeline junctions, and replace destroyed electrical transformers. Within 3 weeks, multiple installations had restored up to 60% of pre-raid capacity. By October 1943, overall Romanian oil output had recovered to levels approximating 80% of pre-raid production. Axis Command used this recovery period to further increase the defensive density. By late 1943, the anti-aircraft network around Ploiești included more than 260 heavy and medium guns, making it one of the largest concentrated flak belts in southeastern Europe. These included approximately 100 heavy guns of 88 mm and 105 mm caliber, over 120 medium guns of 37 mm and 40 mm caliber, and numerous light caliber weapons forming close-range defensive rings. Fire control coordination improved with additional Würzburg radar stations and hardened command posts. Barrage balloon density increased to approximately 140 units, further restricting low-altitude bomber approaches. Smoke generators were upgraded, enabling rapid deployment of screening clouds over refinery clusters during alerts. Simultaneously, Allied air operations intensified across the wider Balkan region. After the establishment of 15th Air Force bases in southern Italy in late 1943, the average distance to Ploiești decreased significantly. From Foggia airfields, the round trip to Romanian targets averaged 1,500 kilometers, reducing fuel limitations and enabling larger bomber formations. Beginning in November 1943, high-altitude reconnaissance flights mapped refinery recovery progress, revealing restored distillation capacity alongside new defensive installations. The first major post-tidal wave bombing occurred on 5 April 1944, when 83 B-24 bombers attacked Ploiești from high altitude. German and Romanian fighter units intercepted the formation, resulting in the loss of 10 bombers. Although refinery infrastructure sustained damage, production interruptions remained limited to approximately 10 to 15% over the following month due to rapid repair efforts. A larger raid followed on 24 April 1944, involving over 200 B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by approximately 100 P-38 and P-51 fighters. Heavy flak and fighter engagement destroyed 37 Allied aircraft. Damage to the Columbia Aquila and Unirea Speranța refineries reduced output from these installations by up to 30% for several weeks. Axis Command faced increasing pressure from multiple fronts by mid-1944. The Eastern Front advanced steadily toward Romania, stretching German air assets between offensive and defensive duties. Luftflotte 4 diverted fighter units to support ground operations near Iași and Chișinău, reducing permanent fighter strength available to Ploiești defense. Romanian IAR-80 and Bf-109 units were forced to operate under intensified sortie rates, often flying multiple engagements per day during peak raid periods. Maintenance cycles shortened, reducing aircraft availability. Fuel shortages further strained operational readiness as Romania struggled to sustain pre-war distribution networks under continuous bombing pressure. Civilian impact also intensified during this escalation phase. Ploiești's population exceeded 80,000 residents in 1944, many of whom worked directly or indirectly in refinery operations. Air raid frequency increased significantly. Between April and August 1944, the city experienced more than 20 major alerts and numerous smaller attacks. Civilian shelters, many built hastily during 1942 and 1943, became overcrowded. Casualties from bombing and secondary fires increased, though precise monthly figures vary. Romanian civil defense authorities reported several hundred civilian deaths across repeated raids between April and August 1944, with thousands more displaced by destroyed housing near refinery zones. Allied bombing strategy also evolved. Early 1944 operations emphasized direct hits on distillation towers and cracking plants, but by summer, the focus expanded to include rail networks, pumping stations, pipeline junctions, and storage depots. This broader targeting strategy aimed to disrupt not only refinery output, but also the transportation infrastructure required to move fuel to the German armed forces. Attacks on marshalling yards at Ploiești triage and lines connecting the city to Bucharest produced significant logistical delays. From May to August 1944, railway throughput in the region fell by an estimated 25 to 40% during peak bombing months. The escalation period therefore produced a dual effect. Allied forces increased their operational reach and strike frequency, while Axis Command struggled to maintain both refinery production and defensive readiness under mounting pressure. By the late summer of 1944, the situation had evolved into a sustained multi-month crisis characterized by continuous air raids, cumulative damage to industrial infrastructure, and mounting strain on both military and civilian systems. By the summer of 1944, the contest over Ploiești reached its maximum operational intensity as Allied air forces executed sustained, large-scale bombing campaigns designed to collapse Romanian oil production through cumulative destruction rather than single-strike disruption. This phase represented the peak of the air campaign in terms of aircraft committed, frequency of raids, and combined pressure on industrial, military, and civilian systems. Between 1st May and 19th August 1944, the 15th Air Force executed more than 15 major bombing operations against the Ploiești refinery zone and its associated transport infrastructure. Individual raid sizes ranged from 150 to over 400 heavy bombers, primarily B-17s and B-24s, supported by growing numbers of long-range fighter escorts, including P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. On 31st May 1944 alone, approximately 380 Allied bombers attacked refinery and rail targets in the region during a single coordinated strike. During this period, Allied planners shifted away from isolated refinery targeting towards systematic network destruction. Raids now combined attacks on primary distillation units, power generation facilities, pipeline junctions, tank farms, railway marshalling yards, and river transport nodes along the Danube. The intent was to prevent emergency repairs from restoring functional production flow. This method sharply reduced Axis repair efficiency. By June 1944, emergency repairs that had previously restored partial capacity within 2 to 3 weeks now required 6 to 8 weeks under continuous bombing pressure. Axis air defense remained active but increasingly strained. By early June, total flak strength around Ploiești exceeded 300 heavy and medium guns. Fighter availability, however, declined. Luftwaffe units redeployed toward the Eastern Front following Soviet advances into eastern Romania. Romanian fighter strength also decreased due to aircraft losses, reduced maintenance capacity, and pilot attrition. Daily fighter sorties dropped by nearly 40% compared to early 1944 levels. The intensity of bombing produced clear production collapse indicators. Romanian refined fuel output fell sharply after repeated June raids. By July 1944, overall oil output dropped to approximately 35 to 40% of pre-May levels. Key refineries such as Astra Romana and Columbia Aquila were repeatedly put out of operation. On the year of August 1944, exactly 1 year after Operation Tidal Wave, the 15th Air Force conducted another major raid involving more than 400 bombers against the remaining functional refinery infrastructure. Combined damage from this and preceding July operations rendered most major refineries either fully offline or operating at residual emergency levels. Storage facilities were hit repeatedly, forcing dispersal of limited remaining fuels into improvised rural sites that lacked efficient transport access. High command decisions during this period reflected the strategic emergency. German General Staff assessments in late July recognized that Romanian oil output could no longer support large-scale mechanized operations beyond local defensive needs. Luftwaffe operational readiness on the Eastern Front declined sharply, with fighter sortie rates in some sectors reduced by 30% compared to April levels due to fuel shortages. As refinery output collapsed under sustained bombardment during the summer of 1944, Axis command shifted from forward defense toward adaptive survival measures intended to extract whatever remaining operational value remained in the Ploiești system. Resistance and adaptation during this phase did not take the form of a conventional counteroffensive, but instead focused on resource preservation, defensive improvisation, emergency relocation of assets, and containment of industrial failure. Romanian and German engineering authorities implemented wide dispersal of remaining fuel stocks beginning in June 1944. Fuel originally stored in large tank farms near Astra Romana, Columbia Aquila, and Creditul Minier was transferred into hundreds of smaller rural depots distributed across Prahova County and neighboring agricultural districts. These improvised storage sites typically held between 50 and 500 tons each and were concealed in barns, forest clearings, and openly excavated pits lined with clay and metal sheeting. This dispersal reduced vulnerability to single-target destruction, but drastically increased transport inefficiency. Pipeline networks suffered cumulative failure. Between May and August 1944, at least 12 major pipeline junctions and pumping stations were destroyed or rendered inoperable by repeated bombing. Temporary bypass systems constructed from exposed railway piping restored only limited throughput. As a result, refinery-to-rail transfer rates fell by more than 60% compared to early 1944 figures. Even when limited fuel could be refined, moving it toward Axis forces in Hungary and Austria became progressively slower and more hazardous. Defensive adaptation continued in parallel. Anti-aircraft batteries repositioned repeatedly as fixed emplacements were destroyed. Mobile flak units mounted on rail cars and trucks were introduced in July to protect evacuation routes and residual refinery components. By late July, total heavy and medium flak numbers had declined from their peak of over 300 guns to approximately 210 operational weapons due to direct destruction, ammunition shortages, and crew losses. Ammunition resupply became increasingly erratic as rail lines connecting Ploiești to Moldova and Wallachia were repeatedly cut. Fighter resistance transitioned into a defensive attrition posture. Romanian IAR-80 and BF-109 formations operated under fuel rationing beginning in June 1944. Average daily fighter sorties defending the region dropped from 65 to under 30 by mid-July. Pilot replacement rates fell sharply. Several Romanian squadrons flew with fewer than 50% of authorized aircraft strength. German Luftwaffe units transferred most operational fighters to the Iași-Chișinău front as Soviet pressure intensified, leaving Ploiești increasingly dependent on Romanian air units alone. Industrial adaptation relied heavily on redundancy at the component level. When cracking units were destroyed, partial distillation continued using low-efficiency atmospheric columns. This produced unfinished fuel fractions that required external upgrading, reducing both quality and output. Electrical power was shifted to improvised diesel generators after centralized grid systems were repeatedly knocked offline. Steam production for distillation was maintained using portable boiler systems brought from dismantled industrial plants elsewhere in Romania. Workforce adaptation occurred under extreme conditions. By July 1944, more than 30% of refinery labor had been evacuated, killed, or displaced. Remaining workers operated under continuous alert conditions. Production shifts were frequently interrupted by air raid warnings lasting several hours per day. Output continuity was maintained only through overlapping emergency shifts and direct military oversight. Romanian authorities employed conscripted labor units and forced labor detachments to sustain minimal production activity. Psychological strain on both civilian and military defenders increased steadily. Between May and August 1944, the Ploiești region experienced an average of 2 to 3 air alerts per day during peak periods. Shelter occupancy exceeded design capacity by 40 to 60% in heavily populated districts. Civilian flight from industrial neighborhoods accelerated. By August, several districts adjacent to Ostra Romana and Unirea Speranța were largely abandoned. Despite these adaptation measures, Axis operational flexibility continued to contract. Emergency repairs that had once restored partial output in weeks now failed to stabilize any sustained production rhythm. Every restoration cycle was interrupted by renewed bombing within days. By mid-August 1944, daily refined fuel output had fallen below 15% of pre-war regional capacity. Resistance during this phase therefore no longer aimed to preserve the oil system as a strategic asset, but to delay its complete loss. Adaptation reduced short-term operational shock, but could not reverse cumulative damage to transport, power, manpower, and defensive systems. By this stage, the Ploiești oil complex had ceased to function as a coherent industrial network and survived only as a fragmented collection of isolated, rapidly failing production nodes under continuing attack. The decisive turning point in the struggle for control of the Ploiești oil system occurred in the final 10 days of August 1944, when military collapse at the front intersected with political rupture inside Romania. By this stage, the oil complex had already been reduced to residual output levels by sustained Allied bombing, but it still remained under Axis administrative control. That situation ended abruptly between 20 and 24 August 1944. On 20 August 1944, the Red Army launched the Second Jassy-Kishinev offensive with more than 1.3 million Soviet troops, supported by approximately 16,000 artillery pieces and mortars and over 1,900 aircraft. Opposing them were roughly 640,000 German and Romanian troops of Army Group South Ukraine. Within 4 days, Soviet forces achieved a full operational breakthrough. German 6th Army and Romanian 3rd Army formations collapsed under encirclement pressure. By 20-30 August, Soviet armored units had advanced over 140 kilometers in some sectors and were approaching the lower Danube crossings. Romanian political leadership concluded that continued alignment with Germany would lead to total occupation and destruction. On 23 August 1944, King Michael I ordered the arrest of Marshal Ion Antonescu and announced Romania's withdrawal from the Axis alliance. Within hours, Romanian armed forces received orders to cease cooperation with German units and to resist German attempts to retain control over strategic infrastructure, including the Ploiești oil zone. At the time of the coup, German security and flak units remained deployed around key refinery sites, but their operational cohesion was already degraded by fuel shortages, ammunition constraints, and air attack losses. German command attempted to execute pre-existing demolition plans intended to deny oil facilities to the advancing Soviet and now hostile Romanian forces. Between the evening of 23rd August and the morning of 24th August, German engineering detachments attempted to destroy remaining cracking units, pumping stations, and transformer nodes using prepared explosive charges. These demolitions achieved only partial success. A number of German flak units were abandoned in place due to the inability to move guns under advancing front conditions. Romanian authorities immediately placed the oil region under national military control. Surviving refinery personnel were ordered to secure remaining technical documentation, preserve undamaged machinery, and prevent further sabotage. Emergency civil order measures were introduced as thousands of displaced civilians began returning to partially destroyed residential districts in search of shelter and supplies. From the German perspective, the loss of Ploiești was no longer a matter of temporary production disruption, but a permanent strategic catastrophe. With Romanian oil gone and synthetic fuel plants already under heavy bombing in the Reich, German liquid fuel availability fell sharply during September 1944. Luftwaffe operational sortie rates declined across all fronts. Training programs for armored and aviation units were curtailed. Several armored formations in Hungary and Slovakia reported fuel allocations cut to less than 40% of minimum operational requirements. For the Soviet command, the capture of the oil region eliminated the last major external petroleum source available to the Axis in southeastern Europe. Within weeks, Red Army forces secured the Ploiești area without large-scale ground combat inside the refinery zone itself, as German units had largely withdrawn or been captured during the collapse of Army Group South Ukraine. The turning point of the Ploiești campaign therefore occurred not through a final air battle over the refineries, but through the intersection of sustained industrial destruction, frontline military collapse, and political realignment. After 23 August 1944, the oil system ceased to function as an Axis asset. Control of the region passed irreversibly out of German hands, and the long contest for the defense of Romanian oil reached its strategic conclusion. In the immediate aftermath of Romania's break with the Axis on 23 August 1944, the operational situation around Ploiești shifted from contested defense to rapid transition of control under wartime conditions. German forces that had previously formed the backbone of local air defense and security either withdrew toward Hungary and Austria or were captured during the disintegration of Army Group South Ukraine. The withdrawal was uncoordinated and executed under constant pressure from advancing Soviet ground forces and Allied air attacks on transport routes. Between 24 and 30 August 1944, multiple German rearguard formations attempted to evacuate remaining personnel, equipment, and limited fuel stocks westward. Rail evacuation was largely impossible due to repeated bombing of marshalling yards and bridges. Road columns moved primarily at night to avoid air attack, but suffered losses along routes leading through Brasov and into western Transylvania. A significant portion of heavy equipment, including flak guns and transport vehicles, was abandoned due to fuel shortages or mechanical failure. Contemporary Romanian military records indicate that dozens of anti-aircraft batteries were captured intact in the Ploiești region during the final week of August. Romanian military authorities moved quickly to secure the oil installations. On 25 August 1944, newly reorganized Romanian units established perimeter control around the major refineries, pipeline junctions, and pumping stations. Priority was given to preventing further German demolition actions and restoring basic order within the devastated industrial zone. Fire suppression teams worked continuously to extinguish residual blazes that had burned for days inside damaged tank farms and processing areas. In several locations, underground fires continued to burn into early September, sustained by trapped fuel residues. Civil administration faced an immediate humanitarian crisis. Ploiești and surrounding refinery districts had suffered widespread destruction after more than a year of sustained bombing. Thousands of residential structures had been damaged or destroyed. Water supply and sewage systems were heavily disrupted. Electrical grids remained largely inoperable in refinery-adjacent neighborhoods. Romanian authorities imposed rationing of food and clean water, while emergency housing facilities were established in schools, warehouses, and surviving public buildings. By mid-September, tens of thousands of displaced civilians were still without permanent shelter. Soviet ground forces entered the Ploiești region in early September 1944. Their primary objectives were to secure the oil infrastructure, prevent sabotage, and prepare for potential transfer of limited production to support Red Army operations. Soviet engineering units conducted systematic inspections of surviving refinery machinery, pipelines, and rail connections. Fuel withdrawals from Romanian stocks to German forces effectively stopped after 24 August. Railway movements carrying petroleum products toward Hungary and Austria were interrupted permanently as front lines shifted westward. German units that had depended on Romanian fuel during the summer of 1944 were thereafter forced to rely entirely on shrinking synthetic production inside the Reich, which itself remained under heavy Allied bombardment. By October 1944, The transition from active defense to post-campaign stabilization was complete. The Ploiești oil system no longer functioned as a weapons-supporting industrial asset within the Axis war economy. Its remaining facilities stood partially destroyed, disconnected from transport networks, and under foreign military administration. The campaign phase centered on defending Romanian oil had ended not through negotiated withdrawal, but through total collapse of Axis control brought about by combined air power, battlefield defeat, and political realignment inside the state itself. The defense of Ploiești left a legacy defined not by a single decisive battle, but by a prolonged industrial and military struggle whose consequences extended across the final year of the Second World War. From a strategic standpoint, the campaign demonstrated with measurable clarity the central relationship between fuel availability and modern mechanized warfare. By September 1944, the elimination of Romanian oil as an Axis resource removed the last major external petroleum source available to Germany. Combined with sustained bombing of synthetic fuel plants inside the Reich, this created a permanent liquid fuel crisis from which German military operations never recovered. Quantitatively, Romanian oil production, which had averaged between 6 and 7 million metric tons annually before the war, and between 5.5 and 6.8 million tons during peak Axis exploitation, collapsed to negligible military value after August 1944. By October, usable output available for organized military distribution fell below 10% of pre-war levels. German aviation fuel stockpiles declined sharply. Luftwaffe sortie rates across all fronts dropped in direct correlation with fuel depletion. Training flights were reduced to a minimum, and operational missions became increasingly restricted to localized defensive actions. German armored formations in Hungary, Austria, and Slovakia reported fuel allocations insufficient for sustained maneuver operations, directly affecting the tempo of late-war ground combat. For the Allies, the Ploiești campaign validated key principles of strategic air warfare. Initial raids demonstrated that even highly concentrated industrial targets protected by dense air defenses could not be neutralized by isolated strikes. The eventual collapse of the oil system resulted not from one mission, but from cumulative destruction of production, power, transport, workforce, and administrative control over a period exceeding 18 months. This reinforced Allied doctrine, emphasizing sustained, system-wide attacks rather than single-point destruction. The campaign also shaped post-war military planning in relation to air defense and industrial vulnerability. Ploiești became an early case study illustrating how layered air defenses, even when dense, could be progressively degraded under repeated pressure through attrition of crews, ammunition limitations, radar disruption, and fighter redeployment to competing fronts. At the same time, the heavy losses sustained by the USAF during Operation Tidal Wave confirmed the extreme cost of low-level attacks against hardened targets without air superiority. Subsequent Allied strategy increasingly favored high-altitude bombing combined with long-range fighter escort to reduce attrition while maintaining pressure. For Romania, the campaign left long-lasting physical, economic, and political consequences. The Ploiești region emerged from the war with much of its industrial base damaged, power infrastructure disrupted, and municipal systems heavily degraded. Tens of thousands of civilians were displaced, and reconstruction extended well into the post-war period under Soviet-influenced economic planning. Politically, the transition of August 1944 placed Romania firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Control over oil resources shifted from Axis exploitation to post-war integration into the Eastern Bloc economic system. In human terms, the air campaign over Ploiești produced sustained civilian exposure to industrial warfare. Between 1942 and 1944, Romanian civil defense records indicate several thousand civilian deaths and many more wounded from repeated bombing of refinery-adjacent districts. The workforce that sustained emergency production operated under continuous alert for months, often under military supervision and with limited evacuation opportunities. These conditions established Ploiești as one of the most heavily bombed urban industrial zones in southeastern Europe. From the perspective of aviation warfare, the campaign marked a transition in operational scale and risk. Between 1942 and 1944, Allied air forces committed thousands of bomber sorties to the Ploiești objective. Operation Tidal Wave alone accounted for the loss of 53 heavy bombers and over 300 aircrew in a single day. Subsequent 1944 operations added hundreds of additional aircraft losses across repeated high-altitude raids. These figures place Ploiești among the costliest strategic air targets in terms of attacker attrition relative to target size. In historical memory, the defense of Ploiești occupies a distinct position as a prolonged industrial battle rather than a conventional battlefield engagement. It was fought through production charts, transport flows, radar screens, and repair schedules, as much as through aircraft and anti-aircraft batteries. Its outcome did not shift front lines directly, but it reshaped the industrial foundations upon which those front lines depended. The final outcome confirmed that by late 1944, Germany no longer possessed the liquid fuel capacity required to sustain large-scale air or armored operations. The collapse of Romanian oil production, combined with the destruction of synthetic fuel infrastructure, narrowed German military options to localize defensive actions during the final months of the war. In this sense, the Ploiești campaign did not merely damage an oil region. It removed a central pillar of the Axis war economy at the moment when it could no longer be replaced.